Get hyperinflation with this one simple trick. You ready for it?
Yeah.
Okay. So there's been an ongoing debate of will the current US monetary policy and worldwide policy be inflationary or deflationary? And generally you get some complicated answer of, well, it's probably going to be both on some days of the week, but not other days of the week, which doesn't really answer any questions. I don't know what the answer is myself, but I think one of the very interesting lenses to think through this is you think through it from a psychological standpoint. And the reason I say this is just as a thought experiment, imagine if the government were to go through and actually put spendable money into everyone's checking account. So that's your account, my account, company's accounts, whatever. They airdrop $1 billion, every single person's account, or whatever, right? Insane, like literal money printing, spendable money in the real economy on the balance sheets of non-bank entities. Okay, whatever, right? But if nobody chooses to spend that money, now that might be unlikely, but let's just pretend that nobody pretends to spend that money. Well, 0 times a really big number is still going to be 0. So in that case, there won't actually be any inflation if people continue spending what they otherwise would have normally spent. Likewise, if suddenly someone would wave a magic wand and a bunch of currency units were to disappear from a bunch of people's accounts, but at the same time, the velocity, the turnover of that money were to shoot through the moon, well, one, let's say unit of currency in the economy times a really, really, really large number, big velocity, would actually give you the inflationary pressures we've seen. That is just to say, prices go up. It costs more to buy a gallon of gas, it costs more to buy whatever. Certainly, if you were to airdrop $1 million into everyone's single checking account and no one chose to spend the checking account, well, let's just say the pump would be primed, the gun would be loaded, whichever way you want to say it, you would pretty much be, everything would be on standby, or the system would be armed. But it still takes, the person to actually go through and do the spending. And if they don't do that, you're not going to get it. That's kind of the core thing I was trying to get through there.
Yeah, there's a lot more talk with inflation rising. What's actually are we gonna have a sustained period of inflation? Now we have people actually talking for a call for hyperinflation. Now I am in the inflation camp myself, but you have to understand, if someone is calling for hyperinflation, they really don't know what they're talking about. It is extremely unlikely that we will see hyperinflation in the United States, but we'll walk through how it could happen, but why it also is highly improbable that it won't.
Josh, why don't you do this? When you talk about the inflation of deflationary camp, and I guess you think yourself more in the former than the latter, can you maybe put some timelines on that? For example, well, just we might see short-term deflation over the next, I don't know, 2-3 quarters, but then, over, let's say 3-4 quarters out, whoosh, it's going to go straight back up. I mean, can you?
Well, in what? In asset prices, I think, yeah, we could see deflation in the fact that asset prices are going down, but I think it's highly improbable that that what you buy in stores is going to go in price. I think the food is going to continue to be expensive. The goods and services, they're going to continue to be expensive, and that is mainly due to government intervention. If the government is handing out incentives for people not to work, for them to get free currency units and the spendable money, then they're not going to work. And if they're not working, there's not goods and services. And what is wealth? It's the goods and services you can buy with your dollars. And where obviously the goods and services are going down. So I think inflation will remain high, but hyperinflation. Why is it highly unlikely? It starts with people see the chart of M2 money supply just exploding, and they're saying, "Oh my God, this is going to cause hyperinflation. There's no way around it." But M2 money supply is just a small portion of total dollars in the world, and the majority of the dollars are outside of the U.S. and completely untrackable to M2 money supply. What do I mean by this? A bank in Singapore can give out a dollar-denominated loan that has absolutely no ties to the Fed. The Fed is not, that Singapore bank doesn't have an account with the Fed. So let's just think about it like this. Let's say M2 money supply is this circle right here. And M2 money supply grows by 30%. And now M2 money supply is growing. But this is the total dollars inside the system. And if the total dollar supply is not growing at the rate that it is used to, or if it's actually shrinking, then M2 money supply increasing by 30% with a decrease in the total dollars in the system, we're actually having a net negative in the total supply. So that goes to where you were talking about velocity. And what is I completely agree. If people don't spend money, then we won't have inflation. But you can't look at the chart of velocity and get an accurate judge of inflation because that's a skewed metric. Velocity is just M2 times GDP. And if M2 is going up, but total dollars is going down, the metric is not an accurate description of what velocity is actually doing.
Well, that's true. That's true. What I also noticed this is that what was that? It came out earlier this week. It was the one where they were talking about retail deposits in like commercial banks are at an all-time high. In other words, the average consumer, average being the key word here, is just awash with cash right now, or that is cash sitting in a bank account or whatever. So I think that.
And then the difference with hyperinflation is when the inflation rate is not 50% a year or 10% a year. It's when it's 50% a month. When you go to the store at 6 a.m. and you buy a loaf of bread for $70 and then you go back the next day and it's $80. It's when the psychological impact is right when you get a currency unit, you have to spend it or it's going to be worth less than when you had it. That is where the psychology really comes into it, when people lose faith in a currency, when they no longer want to hold it. An example would be this is in Weimar Germany's hyperinflation. They wouldn't accept, and instead of trading with Reichmarks, they would trade with cigarettes. If you wanted this good, give me a pack of cigarettes, because that was worth more than any fiat they could give them. So, Justin, what do you think it would take to get to hyperinflation?
It's psychology. I mean, see, here's the thing. I guess what I'm trying to say is that the psychology will override whatever the monetary policy is. Even if they weren't, let's say, even if customers were not awash with bank deposits right now, if money was still turning over, the velocity shot up because people were fearful. As you would say, if you don't spend your paycheck by, the end of the day, you're going to have less, that you can potentially buy tomorrow. That's, I think, going to be the key driver in that regard. And I think it's also interesting to note too, like when you look at that compared to the rest of the world, like you could be going through, let's say, some sort of event, even if it's not hyperinflation, let's just say, prices are noticeably rising, for the average American. But at the same time, too, if you see, let's say, the rest of the world in a panic where they're having this, flight, or where they are seeking a flight to perceive safety, this is, the milkshake theory from Brent Johnson right here coming into play. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, and this is what makes it so confusing in order to tiptoe through this stuff, is that I think you could see inflation in the United States just at the same time you see the dollar strengthen as the rest of the world tries to hop out of whatever their local currency is back into dollars. So I don't know how to reconcile those two things. And I'll also add too, to your point too, with people not working, everyone likes to think of demand as driving prices. And of course, demand does drive prices, but let's just say you keep demand consistent and, you drop supply. For example, people aren't working because they can, make more money doing something else besides working. Okay, well, great. Even if they're still buying the same amount of goods and services, let's just assume that they are, or they can, because they have, the currency units in their account. There's not the same amount of goods and there's not the same amount of goods and services being produced. Well, guess what? That's the same thing as demand going up and supply staying the same. Or it's the net effect. Prices are going to go up. So I think it's very important for people to not forget that it's not just demand. There's a supply component, which, you touched on a little earlier. So I just wanted to make sure that was
Yeah.
people got that.
I would disagree slightly. I do believe it's a psychological effect, but I think that we would need extraordinary more currency units to flood the system for that psychological effect to actually kick in. For example, Dr. Lacey Hunt's theory, if there's a central bank digital currency and the Fed could directly put bank reserves into the consumer's account, which that is not currently the case, or if banks start to lend backed by the Fed, like we saw in March of 2020. This is Russell Napier's thesis. He's not calling for hyperinflation. I don't think this would cause hyperinflation, but if the Fed says, okay, you guys can lend to whoever, and we will back it, so we won't let them, like, if they fail, we'll cover the check. That would really induce banks to spend, which right now banks aren't lending, which is why we haven't seen inflation since 2008, when everyone was calling for this high inflation. The reason why we're seeing it now is because now the government is stepping in with the Fed and creating new currency units where the government spends directly into the economy.
Yeah.
So we would either need the government to spend massive amounts of money, which I think is highly unlikely just because of the political instability. We would need to see banks start to lend, which isn't happening. So I think the only way banks would lend if it was backed by the Fed, or we see a central bank digital currency where the Fed prints dollars directly into the systems to me and you, the consumer. That is something that I think could cause hyperinflation, but I don't think hyperinflation is likely, at least in the near future. What by the near future, in the next decade or 5 years.